All right, well, welcome to this episode of Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And so kind of a brief introduction of what we're going to do in this episode. Nate and I get together we get together at least once a week, and we tend to watch movies in our weekly get-togethers. And we've started, when did we start doing the theme months?
We started that a few years ago because we would get together and we'd spend so much time
trying to figure out what to
watch.
watch.
To do and watch. They were like, we need to just commit ahead of time, and we could do like theme months.
Yeah.
So we could introduce each other to films that each other likes, or things that we're curious. We go and see things theatrically on a semi-regular basis as well.
Well, but we very quickly settled into the theme month pattern, and we have a list of potential theme months that, you know, when we are like, okay, what are we going to do next month? Sometimes we'll sit down and go through this list, and it's got a list of ideas and things like that will pre-populate movies, and you know, based on, sometimes it's a theme, sometimes it's an actor or actress, but we've got a bunch of stuff pre-populated on that list. Anyways, this month our theme was Halloween movies.
Yeah, and we've done that. I guess this is probably the third year that we've done
Halloween
something
movies
for Halloween, and
in October.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's an easy go-to.
And it's always fun for me over the course of the year to kind of spot things like, okay, I want to do this for the Halloween movie. And that actually segues us very neatly into the first movie. So basically, we did our first podcast on Halloween.
Yes.
Which was obviously one of the four. And then we kind of alternated weeks. And the first movie we watched...
Well, real quick, briefly, in the past years when we've done Halloween movies, it's been mostly Nate wanting to show me movies.
Yeah.
So it's mostly been Nate has been populating the movies. And
we did some Hammer horror films. I showed you The Wicker Man.
Yeah. So this year, I went out of my way and said, okay, we knew we were going to go see Halloween in the theaters. Nate always has a list of Halloween movies he could show me. And I said, okay, I'm going to find one that you haven't seen that I want to show you.
Okay.
So the two of these movies were Nate's, and one of them was my pick. So
we'll just kind of do an alternating thing where each of us will talk at first about the film that we had chosen.
Yep.
Or more than one film in my case. And then kind of do a Siskel and Ebert structure, kind of introduce the film, and then throw it over the other person, their thoughts, and then we'll talk about it. So the first film is one that I became aware of in the spring. It was the first film that I watched. I'm like, okay, this is going to be a Halloween movie for Rob. And I wanted to try to do films that were a little different from your usual Halloween fare. The second movie I chose, not as much as this one, but this one is really unique. It's technically a Halloween movie. It's set in October. It has Halloween themes. It's kind of a horror movie, but it's unconventional. It's not the thing you would readily think of when you're thinking of horror films. But I became aware of this film through a website called Red Letter Media. They have a YouTube page, and they do a lot of different movie content, talking about recent releases, talking about awful movies that they make each other watch. And then they have a segment called Review, where there's 5 or 6 people that work for in the main cast, I guess, of Red Letter Media. And they will choose a movie that's important to them for one reason or another, or that they want to talk about. And we'll talk about it for usually around a half hour or so on this show called Review. And they did an episode on the movie The Guest. The Guest is from 2013, and occasionally they have people on the show from the film industry. For some reason, Macaulay Culkin has been a guest a lot recently, I guess in partial conjunction with his podcast, the Bunny Ears podcast. But they had on the guy who wrote this movie. His name is Simon Barrett. So Simon Barrett, he'd had a little success a couple years before this with a film called You're Next, which was a horror film that I've not seen. I'm most familiar with it when I went to Scotland back in 2012. There was one day that we were driving by this other bus. There'd be periods where we'd pass the bus and other periods in which the bus would pass us. And, you know, that sometimes happens when you're on a freeway. And this bus had a poster for You're Next on the side of it. It was just kind of a slightly weird thing to have reoccurring on this bus, like almost duel-like foreshadowing. But anyway, that movie was a success. he's done a number of other films. Him and the director Adam Weingard work together quite frequently. And this film was put together for a very minimal budget. I want to say something like $4 million. And it was shot in New Mexico. It is set around Halloween time. It has a cast that when I went into it, I basically didn't know who any of these people really were. I recognized some of the faces. But the star of the film is a man by the name of Dan Stevens. And at the time I saw this film in the spring, that name meant basically nothing to me. Subsequent to that, I've watched the first season of an FX show called Legion, which he is in, and I also binge-watched Downton Abbey, which I'd wanted to do, and I used the Downton Abbey movie as an excuse to finally binge-watch it. And Dan Stevens is essentially the lead in Downton Abbey. He's English. I did not know that from watching this film because he does a pretty perfect American accent.
Well, you know what role he's probably most famous for, right?
Well, he's in the Beauty and the Beast
He's
remake.
the Beast.
He's the Beast. So apparently he can sing, so he's multifaceted.
Yeah.
We were looking through his filmography briefly. We found he was in a film called Colossal, which we saw together in the theater a few years ago, though we can't quite remember who his character was. I think it was the drunk friend, but again, I can't quite remember. And then he was Sir Lancelot in the third Night in the Museum film.
Yep.
So he is the lead. Other members of the cast include Mika Monroe. If you saw that awful sequel to Independence Day, she took over the Mae Whittingham character because they wanted someone more conventionally attractive because she was going to be obviously a romantic lead. And they had ambitions to make a third one after this, turn it into an Independence Day trilogy, which ain't never happening.
It might be fun if it eventually did,
No, I
but
don't think
off of the strength of the second
The second
it's
one
not happening.
was kind of a painful experience.
Yeah.
Sheila Kelly, I don't know if I'm getting her last name correct. She's in this. She is the wife of the actor Richard Schiff, who played Toby on The West Wing, which is a show that both of us are fans of. And there's a few other recognizable faces in it, but no big names. So the basic plot is the guest, Dan Stevens, shows up at this house in semi-rural New Mexico. There's a family, the mother, father, daughter of Mika Monroe, who's 20, just out of high school, and then they've got a 16-ish-year-old kid who's in high school, who is gay, which I didn't pick up on until late in the film in the first viewing.
Yeah.
And they had an older son who had died, presumably in Iraq or Afghanistan. They have kind of a little shrine on the fireplace with the flag from the funeral and pictures and stuff.
Within some element of military service.
And he passed away probably within the last year or two. It's still kind of raw for the family. And the husband goes to work, the kids go off to do their thing, and there's a knock on the door. And it's Dan Stevens, who identifies himself as a man who had served with their son in the Army. Even says, I was there when he died. And they're able to verify this because there's a picture on their little shrine to their son of Dan Stevens and their son together, buddy-buddy.
Yeah.
So they were really good friends. And it's a little bit awkward. He kind of showed up out of nowhere, but the mother has this feeling that it could be therapeutic to be around him, and they invite him to stay for a time. He says he's just passing through town. And it starts out kind of like some of those earnest Iraq War dramas like Lions and Lambs, Rendition, Stop Loss, that were popular 2006, 2007-ish.
Yeah.
But it ain't going to be one of those movies because while Dan Stevens seems a pleasant enough fellow, there's a moment early on in the film where they're showing him into the son's room. It's like, you can stay in this room. And he sits down and just completely shuts down. Like the face goes just kind of blank, just dead. Something's off with this guy, which over the course of the film we find out more about. These reviews are going to be spoiler friendly, so if you want to be surprised, you should stop listening. Apparently in the original screenplay, it was going to be a little more explicit what had happened to him, a little more sci-fi, that he was basically a cyborg. That is not made explicit in this film, but it's clear that some kind of government experiments have happened on him. They have turned him into more or less a killing machine when threatened.
Yeah.
And he has a line early in the film where he talks about, I thought it was my mission while I'm here with you to help you out. but he's helping them out by killing the dad's business rival and beating up people for the son.
Getting revenge for
getting
the family.
revenge for the family because he's basically programmed to do it. He's gone AWOL because the experiment didn't work out right. And eventually, the daughter, Mika Monroe, realizes something's up, contacts the military to get more information on this guy. It flags some high security group that, hey, this guy we thought was dead, he ain't dead. He's turned up in New Mexico. And so the lead of that group heads there to apprehend him, sets the guy off, and one of the things he's programmed to do is to wrap up the loose ends if he thinks he's been compromised. And so the loose ends would be his friend's family. And it's good. It's unconventional. It's got some good tension to it. I love what they were able to do on the budget that they had. Setting it in New Mexico, I think, was principally for tax purposes. But it worked because you never really see New Mexico. I mean,
Yeah.
Breaking Bad, I think, is what people think of when they think of a production in New Mexico.
Yeah.
But I was just surprised by it. It was just different enough to really intrigue me, and I was quite satisfied with the film. So, Rob, what are some of your thoughts going into the film? I know I told you very little about it, and then ultimately your thoughts about it having seen it.
Yeah, I didn't have any thoughts you kept me in the dark going into it. I didn't have a lot of knowledge of it. It's interesting that you mentioned that in the screenplay he was supposed to be cyborg. I think I commented to you either watching it or shortly thereafter that it wasn't clear whether he was a cyborg or if this was like a Treadstone type project. But obviously something's off with him, but that's not ever made perfectly clear in the film.
Get into Treadstone for me for a moment. Refresh me on that.
Jason Bourne.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's been a while for that for me.
But I had,
That's kind of what I thought. It's like they've genetically manipulated him somewhat.
Yeah. Yep. I kind of made a couple notes of good and bad about this film. I guess we'll get the bad out of the way. Or the good. I guess I'll start with the good. The movie does a great job of building tension.
It does.
Yeah.
And one thing that this film did as well, and they hint at it from the opening font, which is the John Carpenter font, is they said, we wanted to make a John Carpenter-like film, but we did not want to make it just homage to the kind of stuff he was doing in the 70s and 80s. We wanted to make it current. And I think it succeeds as that.
Yeah. I mean, this is definitely a film I'd be willing to see again. I think probably my favorite scene from the movie is the scene in the bar.
Okay, the bar scene.
So there's this scene where Dan Stevens, whose character's name is David, picks up the son from school and he's getting kind of bullied, and they go to this. He follows their car and they go to a bar. So he takes the kid into the bar with him. I forget what drink he orders, but he orders a drink with the specific purpose
of pissing them off. So
no, he orders it with the specific purpose of he's going to piss them off, and then he's used the drink to throw it in this one guy's eyes. As this fight scene, but it turns into this brawl scene at the bar, and it's just a great scene. But yeah,
that's the first scene where they really show
he's going
$6 million man type speed and agility.
Yeah, kind of some of the bad. It felt like there was a lot of the plot points of this film were left probably on the cutting room floor. There's a lot of holes in the plot that it's not obvious why there's holes in the plot. Mm-hmm. Like we mentioned, some of the things, like it's not obvious whether he's a cyborg, whether he's been genetically modified. It's never made clear what his problem is.
You don't get a really good sense of the timeline about precisely how long the son's been dead, because part of it makes it sound like the son's been dead for a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Because Dan Stevens may have been killed there too. But then there's also parts that make it sound like it's been a year or more, and maybe Dan Stevens was still in the project until recently.
Well, so, I mean, when he shows up, he says he just got out of the military. Mm-hmm. So it's not clear whether they think the whole project's been wiped out in some sort of combat action, and he survived and he makes his way to come back.
Yeah, they actually do talk about that later on when they have the scenes at the control group. They thought Dan Stevens had died.
Yeah, that's clear.
They had ash But it indicates that the friend must have died like a year earlier. So this was an ongoing project.
Well, that's what I'm saying is it's not clear what exactly makes them think he's dead and why it took so long for him to reappear. Mm. That's never made clear. My other big critique would be that once the action really starts unfolding, it probably kind of moves a little too fast. They could have stretch that a little bit. That's something else that, I mean, it seems like that was probably then at that point heavily edited. But yeah, I mean, once the action really starts going, it goes really quick.
Yeah, yeah. There is that shift moment when the military shows up in all those classic military SUVs, pulls up to the property where he's helping the mother do the laundry, and then he just goes full Jason Bourne on him.
Yeah.
And you're kind of sympathetic to him to one degree or another. It actually does a pretty good job of you're sympathetic to him from the start, and then you start to see he's doing these fishy things and he's killing people.
Well, I think it speeds
But
up
he's-
even a little before that, like the gravel pit scene.
Yeah,
That could have been easily been extended a little bit
Yeah.
further. That goes really
where he
quick.
kills the boyfriend's friend
Of the-
and
yeah.
then, of the girl,
Yeah.
and then later frames the boyfriend
Yep.
because he's smart and everything's even very planned, even though it doesn't appear to be at first. But yeah, that could have been the moment where you lose sympathy with him, and you kind of do. But it's not until he turns on the family that you're really fully write him off, because you're like,
Yeah.
oh, poor guy, he can't help himself. He's programmed. And there is still a certain element of sympathy in that he's not in total control of what he's doing, but you sympathize for the kid. You sympathize for Micaiah Monroe more than you do from him once he starts going after the parents and them.
Yeah.
And it's got a nice little ending there at the Halloween. The son has gotten in trouble for something Dan Stevens has done, and they kind of plea bargained to him
Oh, yeah.
in a pretty amusing scene. They're going to suspend him, but he basically threatens the principal with legal action. And it's like, he's a gay student. You don't want this to get to the media that you're punishing the gay student for defending himself.
I kind of forgot about that, but that was awesome.
And so he ends up getting assigned to work on the school Halloween dance, and they have like a scary hallway thing they set up that you're supposed to walk through before getting to the dance, and they end up having a fight sequence in that hallway, and it all ends with the school on fire, the school gym on fire
Yeah.
at the end. And it's got one of those little twist endings that set up a possibility of a sequel, which I don't think will ever happen.
No, I don't
But
think
it's
so.
appropriate, especially if you're going for kind of a John Carpenter thing. Kind
Yeah.
of like the end of Halloween. Where
That's
they're
true.
Kind of like, was this a last minute decision to be less definitive about the destiny of Michael Myers? Because as we're filming this thing, we're thinking this may be a to do. We may have some future with this franchise. But
Yeah.
it was not a horribly successful film, but it's just kind of a pleasant little oddity.
Yeah, from what I can see real quick, it looks like I'm seeing that there was a estimated $5 million budget, and its worldwide gross looks like it was about 2.7 million.
Yeah. So, and that would be theatrical. I'm assuming that
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
DVD and streaming and things, we'd be able to make back your $5 million budget on something. Like
Pretty close, probably, I assume. So,
So, ratings. I would definitely recommend The Guest, not to all audiences, but for what it is, it's enjoyable.
if you're into horror films, yeah, absolutely. This is definitely a recommend seeing it.
Unconventional horror film. I would give it 3 stars on a 4-star scale, and probably a 6 or 7 on a 10 star.
We're pretty close. I'd give it 2.5 on the 4-star scale. On the 10-star scale, I'd give it a 6. So that seems like it's a soft recommendation for me, but I definitely enjoyed this, and I definitely would recommend seeing it. But it has its flaws, but it's definitely worth seeing. And if you're into kind of that genre and are looking for the unconventional horror film, this is definitely up your alley. It is rated R. Well, from there, the next week of our theme month, the week and the movie that I picked, we went then to the 1988 Child's Play. And I picked this because I have memories of seeing this when I was a kid and just being thoroughly terrified of this movie. Nate had never, I don't know how I found out Nate had never seen it, but when I found out Nate had never seen this movie, I was like, okay, this is an easy horror film. We're going to watch this in October. And I guess moving into kind of the plot, the movie opens up with Charles Lee Ray is in a shootout with a detective. He's trying to get away from the detective, and at some point his getaway driver ditches him. So Charles Lee Ray, who's played by Brad Dourif.
This is Chicago, right?
It's set in Chicago, yes. So Charles Lee Ray breaks into a toy store for cover. The detective follows him in, mortally wounds him, but despite his wounds, Charles Lee Ray is able to this seems like a huge toy store
Uh-huh.
because Charles Lee Ray is able to move away from the detective and has enough time to get away from him and have a little time to himself. And he stumbles into this display of this popular doll,
The nice guy.
is able to use voodoo and transfer his soul into the doll. Flash forward, the mom is, it's the son's birthday. He's into this show. She's got him some toys from his birthday. She's at work and has an opportunity to buy one of these dolls at a huge discount.
They're called the Nice Guys. They have some kind of tie-in television show, which they show clips of early on, and it appears to be modeled on the My Buddy
Yeah.
doll, which was very popular in the 80s. Only this one has a voice chip.
Yeah. The mom is Catherine Hicks, who plays the mom, Karen Barclay, and her son is Alex Barclay, Andy Barclay, played by Alex Vincent. And anyways, so she's at work and has an opportunity to buy this doll for him on a steep discount, buys it, brings it home. This is the doll who's had the soul of Charles Lee Ray transferred into it, brings him home, and the movie starts to unfold with the son, of course, bonding immediately with this doll, and the doll is alive and tells things to the son,
And the son says, it's like, Chucky.
He's
the
alive.
son's- yeah, the dolls, I guess, all, even though they look the same, they're given different names, kind of like the Cabbage Patch Kids. I guess the Cabbage Patch Kids would come with a little name
Yeah.
card. And this one's name is Chucky.
Yep. Well, Chucky is Charles Lee Ray's.
Yeah.
It's not actually named Chucky.
I know, but but they tell you what their name is. Their voice chip's supposed to, and so it tells them its name is Chucky, which of course is Charles.
Charles Lee Ray,
using his nickname.
But so she brings it home, leaves Andy at home with a babysitter who is played by Dina Manoff. Her name's Maggie Peterson. There's some really kind of funny scenes, where this happens. And I don't remember exactly what Andy says, but there's a point where the babysitter is telling Andy to do something, and Chucky, he's talking to Chucky, and he tells the babysitter, yeah, Chucky says stop being such a bitch or something along those lines. But that scene was pretty entertaining to me. Of course, nobody believes Andy that the doll is telling him what to do. At one point,
And
actually,
he's like supposed to be like 6 years old.
yeah. At one point, while Andy's being babysat, news coverage comes on of the death of this criminal, and they're told to go to bed. The babysitter turns off the TV. Chucky leaves the bedroom, goes back out, turns the TV back on. And that leads us into the horror part of the film, and Chucky as the doll killing people, and it's somehow miraculously investigated by the same detective who had the shootout with Charles Lee Ray.
Chris Sarandon, Susan
Yeah.
Sarandon's brother.
Yep. And the movie unfolds from there. And if you're not already familiar with the plot of the rest of Child's Play, you don't need us to fill you in on it. You can watch it for yourself. But most everybody else who's listening to this is going to be at least vaguely familiar with the original Child's Play. So, Nate, what was your first impressions on seeing it?
Well, my first impressions of the film, even though I only saw it a couple weeks ago, go back to childhood, seeing the previews, and I had this vague memory. It may have been on Good Morning America or maybe some local news show, but I remember some kind of conversation happening about the appropriateness of this movie. I would have been about 8 years old when this movie came out. It's like, this is a horror movie about a children's toy. Kids should not see it, well, obviously. And they showed that clip where the mother, Catherine Hicks, who I knew principally as Dr. Gillian Taylor in Star Trek 4,
Yeah.
picks up the doll, opens, she realizes that the batteries were never installed, and she opens up the battery compartment. Nothing's in there. Chucky's head turns around, starts talking to her. And that terrified me as a little kid. I was afraid of especially things coming to life. There was, I don't know if it was an episode of the new Twilight Zone or what it was, but there was something I saw. I think it might have actually been on HBO. I think it was a short about a lady whose husband has one of those old-fashioned ventriloquist dummies, and she's like, it's creepy, throw it out. But the husband hides it and goes somewhere, and then the dummy comes to life and is going to kill the wife because the wife wants to throw it out.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing that and being absolutely terrified by it. So my impression as a child was that this would be a legitimately scary movie. I did not appreciate at that time the idea of a certain tongue-in-cheek element in horror,
Yeah.
which actually leads me to a kind of a little tangent story, which I've told you before. This been 1985-ish. I saw a preview on TV for a movie called Return of the Living Dead, which is a sequel of sorts to Night of the Living Dead, but it's tongue-in-cheek. It has a sense of humor to it. And there's this monster, this zombie in the preview that I later learned is called Tarman. He'd been saved in a barrel for decades after the events of the original Return of, or Night of the Living Dead. And he comes out and he's a threat in this movie. And he's pretty scary looking to a little kid. They got an actor, an emaciated looking actor, so that it looked like he's skin and bones, and he says, brains. And I remember watching that, turning to my dad, like, that movie looks so scary. My dad's like, it's a comedy. And this look of incongruity, this like, no, it's not a comedy. Stop patronizing me. I just saw that thing. That thing is terrifying.
Yeah.
Later, I saw it is a comedy. But when you're a little kid, if something presents itself as horrific, even if it's in a tongue-in-cheek manner, you don't necessarily pick up on that. But it became clear to me as time passed on, and they had the many, many sequels,
Yeah.
that this was not Super Bride of Chucky, and Chucky
Yeah.
has kids, and this movie is not as I keep using the word tongue-in-cheek as the other films undoubtedly got. I mean, it's got a few moments of serious peril.
Yeah.
I like Catherine Hicks in it. Chris Sarandon was fine. The kid is better than the movie requires. There's
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
moment where he's so they think the kid is acting out, and so he's taken into Child Protective Services, blaming everything on Chucky.
Well, they blame him for at least one of the murders.
Yeah, or that well, to one.
Kind of.
Yeah,
That's why he's
kind of.
taken away from the mom.
Well, that's because he follows Chucky to a bad part of town on the elevated train, and a house blows up shortly thereafter.
Which is actually what's actually happening at that point in the story is Chucky's tracking down the getaway driver who left him at the very beginning of the film and is killing him.
Yeah. So the fact that this house explodes around the time the kid's there, we can't prove anything, but that's of concern. He's been acting weird, so they take him into Child Protective Services, and there's a scene where he can see Chucky's walking. Chucky's after him.
Chucky's coming to the hospital to kill him.
He's stuck in this room, and he just has this little breakdown moment that's like, wow, that's good. That's good acting for this little 6-7-year-old kid.
Yeah. I saw this for the first time as a young child. I saw this, I want to say I was probably around the age of 10 years old. So this would have been 2 or 3 years after it came out. I don't remember the exact circumstances. What I do recall is I snuck out of my bedroom while someone else was watching this. And I watched this without them being aware that I watched it. So I was not supposed to have seen this, but this just terrified me. So I missed the entire beginning. Perhaps my reaction might have been a little bit different if I'd seen the beginning. So I would have come in watching it probably about the time that Chucky's at home with Andy. And
so it's like the doll just came to life and started killing for no reason, which is scarier than having the plot.
Well, so as a young child, in my parents' house, I lived in the basement. My bedroom was in the basement. And our family room is just, the majority of the basement is just this one great room. And then the bedroom at the end of that has no windows, anything like that. So like going to bed at night, I'd have to cross a dark basement into a bedroom with no windows. And there was a wall of toys that was adjacent to the bedroom. And I remember this one doll in particular just kind of sat in the corner. And I can remember numerous times looking across the basement of that doll, staring at me, and walking across the basement watching the doll the whole time, like in the back of my mind for many years, is this doll going to turn into Chucky, yeah. But yeah, it terrified me. I know I had seen it again sometime in the early 2000s, but I have very little recollection of doing that may have been at a period where I had an injury at work and was on pills, and that's why I don't remember it. But I do know I saw it sometime in the early 2000s. I have no recollection of it. Seeing it now today as an adult, man, that opening is super cheesy. The middle is really good. There's good tension there.
I like how they don't get to the animatronic. You don't see Chucky really move or do anything fantastical until about halfway through the movie. So they'll have shots that are supposed to be from Chucky's point of view, close to the ground as he's walking around.
Or shots of Chucky's back.
Yeah, just little things to hint at it, but they don't actually show a Chucky that the characters are really interacting with in any meaningful way until about halfway through the film.
Yeah.
And again, I think that build-up really works for the movie.
Kind of a couple notes I had. Yeah, like I said, the opening is terrible. The scene where Andy repeats what Chucky said about the babysitter, again, I thought that was really hilarious. The scene where Eddie, who is the getaway driver, gets blown up, I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah.
The cops not believing anything that's to be expected. The movie really builds towards the end. Again, seeing this as an adult, it's pretty cheesy. But yeah, like you mentioned, the kid who plays Andy is better than the film required.
Yeah.
But yeah, so how would you rate this movie? I probably suppose this is possibly the weakest of the movies we watched this month.
Yeah, this is. When you start to watch a franchise, especially horror franchise.
But let's also put into context, this is also somewhat of a cultural icon.
Yeah, and I mean it was recently rebooted earlier this year with Aubrey Plaza.
Mm-hmm.
I have not seen that. But when you're starting something like this that becomes a big many entry franchise, I tend to be kind of easy on the first film because I know that it's almost certainly just going to be downhill.
Yeah.
So that probably bumps this thing up a little bit. I would probably give it 2.5 stars and probably a 6.
Yeah.
5 or 6.
Now I'm slightly better than Nate on this one. I gave it 2.5 on the 4-star scale, and on the 10-star scale, part of me wants to give it a 6, part of me wants to give it a 7. So I'm kind of somewhere in that area. Again, I'm a little bit generous because it's the first in the franchise.
And they end it in such a way that and you have this like with the Hammer or Dracula films. Like, oh, he's done.
Yeah.
They got rid of him. They set up. This is the way you get rid of him, and they do it. But it made a lot of money.
Yeah.
So the writers got to figure out a way to bring him back.
Figure out a way around it. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's like I said, it's cheesy, but it's even if you have no interest in seeing any of the sequels, I'd say this one's worth seeing.
Yeah, it's cheesy. It's better than I expected it to be. It was directed by Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor, but Tom Holland, the veteran horror director, who is very capable, and so it's of higher quality than I anticipated it to be. I did want to talk briefly though about the aftermath of this movie. Because I like speculating on what happens after the movie. So
real world implications.
So by the end of this movie, you have about 4 people left alive that are aware that Chucky was indeed possessed by this criminal.
Yeah.
And I just can't imagine how they're going to write this up in their report.
Yeah.
Because it ends that Chucky's been pretty much obliterated. One of them has been shot and stabbed a couple times.
I don't remember if they're shot, but certainly there's stabbings and yeah.
And they're gonna have to explain the stabbings and
both the mom and the detective been stabbed or cut multiple times.
And what happened and why did you guys disappear and why was the kid? What happened to the doctor at the kid's the
hospital?
The hospital because he's dead. Yeah, it's like you can't. Are they gonna have to come up with a story? Are they gonna have time to make a coherent story? Or are they gonna go with it? I mean, you can't report that the little doll did this.
Yeah.
You just have to be. I don't know. We have amnesia. We all have collective amnesia. We don't know what happened.
Well, I mean, I assume you would write up some sort of story, but there's a lot of stuff. The overturned car in the road. There's a lot of things to be explained here that you're gonna have to come up with some story to explain it. These cops are
gonna get suspended. Because their superiors are gonna be like, you're not telling me the whole story.
I don't know. This is the 1980s. With you could, I mean, if you sat down in the I mean, this is purely speculative, but 1980s, you sit down, tell the cops the real story, and say, here's our alternative version that came up. Your superiors might just be like, nobody's going to believe this, so just write it up.
Yeah,
we'll move on. But yeah, you could get suspended, but probably at least in a 1980s film magic. They're going to tell their superiors what really happened, write it up, and it's going to move on.
And Andy's going to be in therapy for the rest of his life.
Yeah, Andy's going to be a messed up kid. Okay, that's Child's Play, so we will here shortly move into our third film.
Critters was the 4th film we watched for October theme, and the 3rd and final film that we'll be discussing on this episode. First film, Halloween, of course, was in our inaugural episode.
Standalone episode.
Find online. Critters, like The Guest, is a film that my recent viewing of it was inspired, again, by Red Letter Media. They did a review episode about it and the other films in the franchise. I had talked, as I talk about in the Halloween episode, for a long time I'd wanted to watch, or at least get started on one of the great 80s horror movie franchises. Your Halloweens, your Friday the 13th, your Nightmare on Elm Streets. Critters is kind of second tier. They made 4 films. Well, they actually made 5 films in the franchise. The most recent one came out this year after a gap of 1991 to 2019.
Wow.
But I've been curious about this franchise. It was shorter, so it was more doable. I ended up getting the 4-pack DVD of the first 4. I remember as a kid seeing the posters for this, and like Chucky, I did not anticipate the tongue-in-cheek element to it. And the critters, they're hedgehog, porcupine monsters. They look scary, and
Yeah.
the film artwork. I have a very distinct memory of a poster of it at a little mom and pop video place that we used to go to, and being scared of the poster. And then you also see that poster in the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie.
Oh, yeah?
Raphael, when he goes out at night to see the movie in his corny Turtles trench coat outfit, he goes to see Critters, and he makes some comment coming out of the theater, where do they come up with this stuff?
That's funny.
But Critters is a film. The screenplay went through some changes in pre-production. It was the big change in it came about as a result of the success of Gremlins, where they decided to make the critters a little bit more like Gremlins, so they can have those little gags of
Yeah.
these little monsters running around getting into various hijinks. But there's really kind of 2 principal narratives going on in it. There's one about the critters and one about the space bounty hunters sent to get the critters. So the opening sequence of this film, and the cast is really basically a nothing cast, other than that it is the film debut of Scott Grimes, who was on ER. He's been in a lot of things. He's a voice on the American Dad show. He's in it. Dee Wallace Stone, who was the mother in E.T., which actually kind of comes in as a little meta later in this film,
Yeah.
is in it, and she did a lot of horror films, especially at this point in her career. M. Emmett Walsh plays this local sheriff. M. Emmett Walsh is still alive. He's still acting, but he has looked like he could fall over dead at any moment since I think at least the mid-'70s.
Yeah.
Everything I see him in, he looks like he's just about to have a heart attack.
Looks like he's the same age in every film.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So anyway, it starts out in space. The beginning of this film reminds me a little bit of the beginning of the film A Night of the Creeps, which we watched last year, where the creeps are out in space with this parasite thing that ends up causing
Yeah.
the plot in that movie. This starts out in space. There's a penal colony on an asteroid. They're bringing some critters, which are called Krites, to the prison. They're ravenous creatures. They eat everything, and the transport taking them to the prison asteroid said we had to kill 2 of the 10 on the way here because they're just eating everything. And we had to keep them under control. Why they're being sent to a prison when they're essentially treated as animals, but they're also shown to be intelligent and have a language, and they steal a spaceship from the prison asteroid. The warden, who looks kind of like Donald Trump in Martian makeup, he sends these 2 putty-faced space bounty hunters, and the putty faces so they can take on the image of whatever the natural inhabitants.
They morph.
They're
Yeah.
morphing bounty hunters. They follow the Krites. The Krites get a head start. Their ship, they said, had like enough fuel to go across the galaxy 20 times, which seems excessive. But somehow they're able to track the.
But they
the
comment on
Krites.
they don't have food, though.
They don't have food.
So they're gonna be
gonna
looking
have to
for somewhere.
stop. They stop on Earth. They land in this little town called, or just outside of this little town called Grover's Bend, Kansas, which is a play on Grover's Bend. Grover's Bend, New Jersey, was the town where the Martians land in Orson Welles' 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast.
Oh, yeah.
So they land out in the farm, or out in the country, and they end up terrorizing this farm family, who we get a nice little introduction, very 80s introduction at the beginning, where you have the dad, who's Billy D. Bush,
Greenbush?
Billy Greenbush, and then the mom's Dee Wallace Stone, Scott Grimes is the little boy, is probably 13-ish. And I want to say Nadine Van der Velde is the teenage sister. So you have goings on with them. And Don Oper plays this handyman. He's kind of a little slow. He's a rough equivalent to the Randy Quaid character in Independence Day.
Yeah.
Another Independence Day reference.
Yeah.
He believes that aliens have been contacting him through the fillings in his teeth.
Yep.
So there's various goings on at the house. The dad's preparing for a bowling championship. The teenage girl brings a boyfriend played by Billy Zane, who's new in town from New York.
Yeah.
She turns out to be the more sexually aggressive partner, which I kind of like because that goes a little bit against convention. So you've got the goings on with this family, and they see a shooting star or something. Turns out to be the Critters ship. They get out, they mutilate some cows. Eventually, they have the family kind of under siege. They try to get out, but they destroy the two vehicles they have, and so they're trapped in the house. And Scott Grimes has to go out to get help. The space bounty hunters have gotten a rough location on the Krites, but they land some distance away. They have various interactions with the cops and townspeople. The morphing heads turn into a recurring gag.
Well, they start to morph, or at least one of them morphs on the radar, or somehow they get a hold of media broadcasts.
Yeah, so they get this little media package, like a Get to Know Earth. This is the
Well, and they're
culture.
watching like a
They watch this rock
music video.
80s rock music video. Johnny Steele, I think, is the name of the guy.
I forget, but one of the aliens morphs into him.
And they have this song, this kind of cheesy 80s rock ballad that I think they play at least 3 or 4 times over the course of the film.
Yeah.
So in town, you've got this rock singer in this weird outfit walking around with the putty guy who turns into the first person he turns into is Ethan Phillips, who is a cop who gets killed by the critters. And so he turns into not the cop, but a dead version of the cop. So he's a walking corpse. They have an incident at a church where he becomes the preacher, and then they go to the bowling alley, and they have a confrontation there, and he turns into Don Oper, who's the hired hand.
Yep.
Emmett Walsh, the receptionist lady at the police department, which appears to have like a total of 3 people on staff.
Yeah.
Because it's a tiny little town. Gets him up, and he's trying to figure out what's going on, and then they have reports of issues over at the farmhouse. The family can't contact anyone because the critters have taken out the
phone lines.
The critters have their various gremlins-like moments around the house, playing with things, playing with dish soap. One is interacting with a stuffed E.T. toy, which again is meta because Dee Wallace is in this film.
Yeah.
It's just a fun film. It's very 80s. If I didn't know this movie was from the 80s, I would think someone was intentionally trying to do an homage
to an 80s film.
Movies, because there's just so many 80s elements to it. And the fact that this is kind of a take on Gremlins, it's a take on The Last Starfighter, it's a take on any number of small town under siege monster movies. It's kind of a distillation essence of a good portion of 80s cinema, and I just found it rather likable. What were your thoughts on Critters?
I liked it. This was my first time seeing it. I don't know that I have I enjoyed watching the first Critters, but I don't know that it gives me a strong inclination to watch any of the follow-up films. Kind of like Child's Play.
Yeah.
It's good to see the original. I don't know that I want to see any of the other Child's Play movies anymore. I don't know that I want to see any more of the Critters movies. Probably some of my favorite moments in this film, as you mentioned, when the bounty hunters first come to Earth, one of the first things they come across is the dead sheriff's deputy, and one of them morphs into the dead sheriff's deputy, but they take his car. But they don't know how to drive, and so they somehow inadvertently put it into reverse and are driving in reverse.
Yeah,
so they drive all through town in reverse. Eventually, they then learn how to drive forward, but they drive for quite a prolonged period in reverse, and that's kind of entertaining. And the scenes around the farm is great.
And it really is kind of 2 movies that meet up at the end.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to know what this film would have looked like had they not altered the critters to conform more to the Gremlins archetype.
Yeah. Yeah.
It would have been more just a space bounty hunter film.
But I like what they made the gremlins, or what they made the critters become. It works. And one of the things that you mentioned to me when we first watched it is how long it takes in this film before you actually see the critters.
Yeah. And
or at least their faces.
Yeah, and that goes into like Child's Play, or even Halloween to a lesser extent, that you don't reveal the monster too early.
Yeah.
And so it is around the halfway point before you really get a good look at these critters.
Yeah. And some of the critters change in size, and
one does. Yeah. One gets bigger. It's kind of like the
he's
alpha.
overeating.
Yeah, he's overeating. That's a thread that they don't really follow up in the later films. So I have not seen the 2019 Fifth Critters film, but as I mentioned, I got the 4-pack. I watched all 4 films a couple months ago, and when I was watching the review episode, they basically said 1 and 2 are good, 3 and 4 aren't so good.
Yeah.
So 1 and 2, 1 is the strongest, 2's close, 2's a worthy sequel. 3 is kind of so 3 came out in 1991. It was the film debut of Leonardo DiCaprio. And a group of these critters end up at this kind of semi-dilapidated apartment complex in, by implication, Kansas City. And I like any kind of story where people are stuck in a confined space and you got a diverse group of people trying to survive. It goes back to at least the Poseidon Adventure. And I just kind of like that, and it's not great, but I just imagine if I had seen this when it came out in 1991, when I was 11 years old, I would have thought it was awesome. And so watching it, I was kind of vicariously watching it for the 11-year-old me. So it's not great, but it's watchable. 4, on the other hand, which takes place in the future, is pretty crappy. It is.
So it sounds like 2 and 3 are worth seeing.
2 and 3 are worth seeing. Yeah.
But 4 probably not.
4, no.
Yeah. So 2 and 3 kind of maintain the consistency of the first one.
Yeah. 4. Probably the biggest thing of note in 4 is Angela Bassett. About a year before Malcolm X. So just before she became a star, and I imagine she's a little bit embarrassed about having been in Critters 4, because it ain't no good.
Yeah. Yeah. So how would you rate the first Critters?
The first Critters, again, I'd probably give it 3 stars.
Really?
Yeah.
I guess in hindsight, I would say, part of me wants to say Critters ends up being kind of the weakest of the 4 films we saw. I'd probably still be in that 2.5-star range, but on the 4-star scale. But on the 10-star scale, I'd probably give it a 6.
Yeah, I'd probably give it a 6 to 6.5, 7.
Again, I think this is a movie that, despite the mediocre or perhaps soft ratings, definitely worth seeing.
Yeah.
At the right time of year. Granted, this episode is coming out actually past Halloween, but, we were finishing these movies around that time, all those types of things. If you listen to this podcast, say October 2020, go for all of these films. They're fun. They're great to see. They're easy ones within the horror genre. They're not what gives horror films, at least nowadays, they're a bad name.
They're not excessively
fun.
gory. None of
them are, no. But yeah, they're fun. It was a good movie.
Yeah. So that is this episode of Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. I am Nate.
And I'm Rob.
And we'll not see you next time. I mean, it's convention to say we'll see you next time, but we won't see you because it's not like
we'll hear you later.
Conversational. It's kind of one of those pointless conventions that I'm now rambling about for no reason.
Good enough for me.
Next time.